Thank you so much for making time to be with us today for our monthly National Center webinar. And we are lucky to have Ashley here with us, but I'm going to cover a little bit about the National Center and then I'll hand it off to Ashley so that she can share her expertise with you all. Okay, so next slide. So just a little bit about the National Center. I don't want to take too much time today, but the National Center is funded through the Children's Bureau, and we are working to increase accessibility of adoption competent mental health services. And you can see this is kind of our North Star. We really want to ensure that families have access, families who have experienced the child welfare system have access to services that are adoption competent and can access them as soon as they need them. And in order to do this, we are working with states, tribes, and territories, that's SCTs, to strengthen their capacity to become systems that are preventative and truly healing, and to embed adoption competence within all of their services and work with families. Next slide. So we're here to talk about ACEs today, and Ashley is the expert on that, so she will cover most of this. But I just wanted to highlight, and I'm sure this is not new information for you all, but the reason why the National Center was created is because children and youth who have experienced child welfare have higher mental health needs, and they are more likely to be diagnosed with mental health disorders, experience higher rates of ADHD, depression, anxiety, and many other diagnoses. They are also more likely to be prescribed psychotropic medication. And if their mental health needs go unaddressed, 60% will go on to have lifelong disorders. So that is what we are here at the National Center hoping to have a positive impact. Next slide. So you'll hear from Ashley today that 2/3 of children experience at least one traumatic event by the age of 16. And obviously for our population, children in child welfare, that is much higher. Half or more have 4 or more ACEs. And children with 4 or more ACEs are nearly 5 times more likely to exhibit internalizing behaviors and higher levels of externalizing behaviors, such as aggression or acting out. I do want to note that when we're talking about ACEs, it's important to say that their adult ACEs scores are not the same as children risk scores, but we also want to acknowledge that ACEs are a population level risk indicator. It is not like predictive. It is not destiny. Next slide. So this is actually a tool that was created specifically for use with children. There is a parent report and a youth self-report version. It includes ACEs, but it also includes related life stressors. And it's designed specifically to assess for current functioning, caregiver stress, protective relationships, as well as observed symptoms. So it's not just a numeric score alone. But it's also important to note that ACEs always should be paired with assessment of protective factors. So that is what I want to talk about real quickly. Next slide, please. So protective factors, I think we're all familiar with these, but protective factors that can help mitigate ACEs are permanency, attuned caregiving, felt safety, and cultural identity, because they can help to build resilience and foster safe, stable, and nurturing relationships that reduce toxic stress. And what I wanted to share today, because our focus, obviously it's in our name, we're focused on adoption competent mental health, fits in really nicely with promoting protective factors. We are looking at not ACEs as fixed predictors of poor outcomes, but that we really can have a positive influence for children who've experienced ACEs. Because we know in adoption competent care that relationships can help heal the impact of early adversity. Caregiver preparation strengthens stability and attachment. Identity informed and trauma responsive care promotes long-term well-being. And we know that adoption competency functions as a modifiable intervention that can change the trajectory of early adversity. So we want children to have access to adoption competent mental health as soon as possible. And so we're doing this through cross-system collaboration. Next slide. So this is kind of just a quick overview of what we're doing at the National Center. We use cross-system collaboration. So we start with child welfare and mental health, and we bring them to the table, and then we start to extend the invitation to other child serving systems. And we do this in order to train the workforce in adoption competency. And then once we have mental health providers trained in adoption competency, we then want to address kind of any sort of accessibility barriers. So whether it's like insurance access, Medicaid access, we also have a directory of providers so that families can find them. Next slide, please. So we know that our population are more likely to experience high levels of adversity. So we see adoption competence as kind of the solution. And so we just wanted, we're here today to talk about ACEs, but we wanted to kind of just connect the dots a little bit about how adoption competent mental health services can fit in. So we really are looking at a prevention approach. And we do all of our work in relationships and preparing caregivers to strengthen stability and attachment. And we're also using trauma-informed care, but then kind of taking it the next step further. Next slide. So this is just a list of resources, and you will receive the slide deck so you can peruse these resources when you have extra time. It's just kind of some complimentary information about ACEs to support your continued learning. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and let Ashley, the main event, take over. Oh, I need to read the bio. Hold on. Molly, do you have her bio up?
You don't need to do anything.
Oh,
You're
I wanted
welcome to.
Well, thank you for being here, Ashley.
Awesome. We'll dive right in. We're on a
Yes.
time crunch today. All right. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for that and for having me. Thank you all for choosing to just take some time out of your day to be here for this webinar. I think it just speaks to the volume of our shared mission, right, which is to reach kids who need us. And I'm really honored to be here to speak with all of you. And I think everything that Erin just provided was a perfect preview of kind of what I'll dive a little bit deeper into. And it just kind of loops back to the fact that if anyone is sitting here on this webinar and wants more on a certain subject matter or area of expertise or a skill training, the National Center has resources for you, which is just so wonderful to see. So let me just dive right in. My name is Ashley Bendiksen, as you heard, and I come to you today with not just professional expertise working with trauma-affected youth and working with youth who have experienced ACEs, but also as a former trauma-impacted teenager myself. From the ages of 14 to 20, pretty much all I knew was trauma and specifically abuse and assault. And this really defined my life for a long period of time where I was supposed to be in that really critical developmental stage. And today I will share a little bit more of my story because while it might be different from some of the youth that you work with, there's also so many similarities between kind of the struggles, the barriers, the challenges, how we kind of process the world, how we respond to certain situations. And also, I learned so much in my own healing process about resilience and kind of what it takes to overcome adversity and rise on the other side of it all. And this wasn't something that I just took an interest in. My experiences changed the trajectory of my life, my career, my schooling, and I've now spent the last 18 years working in the fields of victim advocacy, victim services, social justice, policy, systems change, with this soft spot and kind of expertise for how these issues impact youth from childhood to early adolescence. And so I think my purpose today, my hope, is that I can simply share some of my story and my experiences to maybe contextualize what we're discussing and some of what you might see in your work. My hope is that you will continue to see that resilience is possible, which I know you see it already in the work that you're doing, and hopefully walk away possessing just a few more strategies of how to really help children who need you the most. And I know that on this call, we have people from all different walks of their careers and levels of careers. So some of it might be a refresher at times, some of it might be brand new. But my hope is always that the thing that you need sticks with you, that it just gives you a new way of looking at things, or just serves as a really helpful reminder. So at any point, feel free to drop a comment, drop a question. I'm going to do my best to manage all the screens, and feel free to ask anything. We might not have time for questions at the end, just because we're on a time crunch, but we will see as we go. So let me just really quickly, and I won't take up too much time, but I want to share just a little bit more of my story. So join me for a little trip down memory lane. This is, why not share an old photo when you have a chance to? This is me as a teenage Ashley. And yes, that was my first ever selfie on the right, taken on a Kodak disposable camera, which I figured some of the people on this call might appreciate. Had to go all the way to CVS to get that baby developed. And if you would have met me back then, you would have thought that I was a relatively happy, well-adjusted, normal kid. And for most of my early life, I was. I grew up in a very stable, not perfect. The more we know as we become adults, we start to overanalyze everything. But I grew up in a relatively stable two-parent household. I was given lots of opportunities. I was a kid who loved school, was very competent and confident in myself. And, now in retrospect, I can say that that was very much a protective factor later on when I was rebuilding. But for me, unlike a lot of the youth that you might work with, or the majority of the youth that you might work with, my challenges started in adolescence. And unfortunately, it started with my very first dating partner. I was a kid who was, a child of the 90s, went into school, had crushes on everyone, and the moment a boy had a crush back on me, I was on a cloud. I was not expecting harm. I didn't know about things like abuse or domestic violence or dating violence. And unfortunately, what I thought was this, early beginnings of my own teenage love story fairy tale ended up becoming something that changed the course of my life. This first boyfriend of mine was extremely abusive in many different ways, verbally, emotionally, psychologically, sexually. And that became the beginning of 6 years of on and off cycles of abusive relationships and all of those secondary challenges that go along with that. Between 14 and 20, I experienced assault by other individuals. I didn't feel that I had a comfortable or safe, trusted adult in my life that I could talk to about these issues, nor did any of the adults in my life seem to kind of notice. And as well as I thought I was hiding it at the time, I really wasn't. Because I was kind of struggling with this on my own, from that very first relationship, I turned to a lot of self medicating, a lot of unhealthy coping tools. I developed mental health issues for the first time in my life. I had anxiety. I had long periods of depression. I was, coping in really unsafe ways, making other destructive decisions, self harming. My grades went from A's to failing my classes. My life just kind of began to crumble. And as those years went on and as these repeat experiences kept happening, I kind of just felt like I was in constant survival mode or maybe even management mode. I can remember so clearly when kind of another bad thing happened, starting to develop this belief that maybe this was just my life. Maybe this is just the way the world is. Maybe this is just the hand I've been dealt and I have no choice and I just have to face it and manage it and deal with it. But naturally, I could not deal with it on my own. And fast forward in the story, by the time I got to college, I was in such an abusive, classic domestic violence relationship that I was forced to drop out of college. He and I became homeless. I was living out of my car for nearly 3 months. He drained my bank accounts. And the only reason it ended is because he responded eventually with physical violence when I tried to leave. And this is, of course, a big condensed version of my story. It was a day-to-day challenge, right? It was just morning till night, being hyper alert at all times, hyper vigilant, constantly filtering every choice, every decision, every action through the people around me, whether it was safe to do this or to do that. This just became my world. And when it all kind of came, I guess, crashing down with what felt like a rock bottom, being attacked, I had to go through the court system. It was, unbeknownst to me, a moment that would change my life. It was a long process of rebuilding, but that rock bottom for me was a turning point, and it started this whole new chapter of my life. It took a lot of time, a lot of inner work, a lot of healing and building healthy coping tools and habits and understanding relationships and learning to retrust and everything we're about to talk about. But it set me on this path of wanting to be part of this space and to help others like me and answer these big questions of, what are the factors that help people build resilience? What was it that allowed me to come out on this other side? And it certainly has inspired and informed all of my work since. So today, let's kind of break some of these big issues down. Like I said, this comes not just from my professional experience, but from a deep place of lived experience. And I think being that I was a kid when a lot of this happened, a teenager when this happened, this is why, like so many of you, I just have a soft spot for kids who don't deserve to feel that in any given moment. But there's so many things that we can do, as Erin was saying, to change their path, to shape positive outcomes. And we're going to discuss a few of those today. So, while my story is not personal, while my story is personal to me, the experiences and the impacts behind it are not unique. The conditions and protective factors that helped me are not unique either. So let's start by beginning to hopefully better understand adversity, trauma, toxic stress, and also through that lens, kind of understand the needs, behaviors, and outcomes that we see in so many young people so that we know how to respond. So let's dive into a few real quick refresher recap stats. Now, I would be completely remiss if, oh, you know what? I have to shift. This is when I get to live out my former weather anchor dreams. Okay. It's a great software. So, I would be remiss if I didn't start by sharing a statistic that I cannot shout from the rooftops loud enough. And that is the fact that my experience with dating violence is a huge issue. And the only reason I want to share this for a quick moment is because I know so many of you work with youth of all ages. And if you do work with teens and adolescents, taking time to teach them about relational health is so important. In the US, 1 in 3 teens will experience an abusive dating relationship like I did, and that is its own form of trauma. The way that children develop, their identity and their skills in childhood is different from the way teenagers develop, but both are really critical times. So just be aware that this is a huge issue, and I'm sure you're not shocked by this. The internet adds layers, the increasing social dynamics, kids are dating younger. I've had 5th graders relate to my dating story, so just be aware. Okay, got that personal item out of the way. Now let's expand that into the larger conversation of interpersonal violence, right? I experienced one thread in that larger fabric. We all know, you all know that abuse and domestic violence is rampant in the homes of children all across the US. And as Erin mentioned, the number of ACEs and abuse that shows up in children who are involved in care systems, the welfare system, foster and adoptive systems, this is extremely prevalent. And, the data is really all over the place because it's really hard to even quantify. Most of it comes from child welfare services. So this doesn't even account for children who maybe didn't get involved in the system. So the numbers are really large. And when it comes to trauma, as Erin also mentioned, 2/3 of US children will experience at least one traumatic event before the age of 16. So adversity and trauma are not, issues that only impact a small community or population or demographic of young people. All young people can be at risk for experiencing some type of form of traumatic harm. And as was mentioned, this rate is even higher in youth who are in both foster and adoptive systems. And I want to take a moment just to kind of talk about really quick the ACEs study, right? The origin of so much of this, which was done back in the mid 90s, right? And at the time, essentially, oh, I'm back on the screen. Essentially, at the time, this study wanted to look at kind of these main categories, these early childhood experiences that were predictors of secondary challenges in life, not just in their present day life, but even in the short term future and even lifelong consequences. And when the study was first put out, they really looked at these 10 categories. And as you can see, as we're all kind of familiar with, we looked at abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, kind of these issues that occur within the early family unit. But obviously, this has expanded, and our understanding is now that there are many different types of harms that young people can face. Yes, there's those common ones, with abuse being the most commonly cited adverse childhood experience, but young people also struggle from community violence, mental health diagnoses and challenges, poverty, food and housing insecurity, discrimination, systemic issues, identity based harm, bullying, peer victimization, loss, grief, separation. There's, as you all know, research on just that adoption might be inherently traumatic for some kids, or traumatic events or disasters, right? Environmental disasters. The list is exhaustive of what can impact young people. And the more ACEs, the more traumatic or challenging experiences that kids face early in life, this increases the risk that they will experience developmental delays, cognitive and emotional challenges, and also this concept of toxic stress, which essentially is what occurs when children are in these prolonged situations where they're kind of constantly in a state of fight, flight, freeze, right? All children will experience stress in life. We can think of really common examples like your first day at school, or going to the doctors, or getting your first shot, right? These are scary, stressful moments. And in normal, healthy development, parents would attune to their child and help them calm down afterwards, and they kind of quickly return to baseline, right? The stress spikes up, but then they can come back down to a calm place, and this builds healthy stress management. But for kids who are in these prolonged, continuous states of kind of high alert, whether that's they came from an abusive home or instability in the home, or experienced one of those issues that we just discussed, this can leave them in that constant high alert state, right? Their amygdala, the smoke detector, is always waiting for that tiny little sign of smoke because it's anticipating it at all times, which means that the body is in a constant state of stress. And without caring adults or a guide through those moments, a lot of children are not naturally not able to figure out how to manage that stress on their own. So, chronic adversity plus lack of adult support leaves kids in that kind of toxic stress state, and this can lead to a whole slew of issues, which is why often you hear that supportive relationships serve as that protective kind of biological buffer, that attuned adults can help children manage those feelings. And that these are the new pathways, right, that you are all creating by putting them into these safer situations and making sure that they have the right environments, relationships, and conditions to be able to manage that stress, to kind of reset and rewire after living in this toxic stress state. And understanding this is important because trauma is essentially an experience, right? When we talk about trauma, we're not always talking about the event itself or what caused a young person to behave the way they behave. Trauma is simply how a person experiences any event, right? And as we all know, trauma impacts people differently. This is why one child might respond strongly to a situation and the next does not. But it is their experience of what they have been through. And when we think about trauma and ACEs and toxic stress, these are kind of the ways that it impacts a child. It impacts their sense of universal needs, right? We as humans have basic universal needs. And when it comes to kids, the most common ones are a sense of belonging, autonomy, right? Choice, like the ability to have power over one's life, mastery, a feeling of competence, and value, purpose. But trauma inhibits a lot of these or removes them or creates environments where these items aren't able to grow and thrive. We also know that trauma impacts the brain, right? And while we don't have time to go into the neuroscience, the brain responds to stress, trauma, adversity, and it impacts the nervous system, the body, thinking, cognition, memory, processing, learning. But also, trauma impacts how children view themselves, how they view others, how they view the world. And often, as providers, as caring adults in the lives of these vulnerable youth, really that's what we're working to counter, right? It's the skill building and it's the new pathways, but it's also the new perspectives. Often you'll hear people refer to this as kind of a child's private logic, that kind of what you can't see is this, backpack filled with invisible beliefs and experiences, and they have strong views about themselves, others in the world, and that's often what causes their behaviors or their resistance or their walls, right? They have their own private logic that is absolutely understandable based on their experiences. So, what do we tend to see? What do caregivers and parents and families tend to see? Well, this often shows up in challenging behavior. As many of us know, kids express themselves often in the only way they know how. And when they're young, that's often just behavior, not words. So, kids who have experienced challenges act out. They might get really defensive. They might withdraw. They might take risks or make other destructive decisions, even after a conversation. It also shows up as imbalanced emotions, right? Irritability, shutting down, being really hyper vigilant, right? That's that toxic stress state. They're kind of always on high alert. You know, the yelling at home is now the same as just someone shutting a door too loudly, right? They're always kind of on edge. And there might be overreactions, right? Disproportionate responses to things. But to really go down to these beliefs, these are kind of those views, right? This is that private logic that kids carry, that the world isn't safe or adults can't be trusted. I have to stay on guard at all times. No one understands what I'm going through. I don't have a choice. I'll never succeed like other people. I'm broken or it's my fault. And all of these things that I'm sharing, even though they happened to me in adolescence, I lived a lot of those. I was resistant. I struggled to believe that I had choice or power. I did not accept help, nor did I seek help. I was in this constant state of survival, as I've mentioned. And in many ways, I think the greatest wound was simply believing that this was just my life, right? We talk about ACEs not being a life sentence, right? A determining factor of one's future, but I really thought it was. I didn't think that there was any other way. But thankfully, I did turn my life around. And just to go back to my story briefly, it happened the day that I had left this courthouse after my partner had been arrested and charged. And it was such a profound moment because I remember when I left the courthouse, I just kind of took this deep breath and I remembered looking to my right and I kind of just realized I was alone for a moment. And it's like for the first time, I felt that I could just relax for a second, that this boy that was now behind bars wasn't right here, right? I was so used to, as I said, filtering every thought, decision, choice through others around me. And for a small moment, I felt I could relax. And it felt like a relief. And I just started to process and think through things differently. And I was angry at everything I'd thrown away for this boyfriend. And then I started thinking about the last few years of my life. And I think I was struck with this big question of, I don't even know who I am. What comes next? I can't do this again. And so in that moment, something sparked, something shifted, a switch was flipped, and I wanted to change my life. I certainly did not just think it and my life changed. There was a whole long journey that still continues to this day of unseen personal inner work, but outwardly, my life did begin to change. And the one thing I never expected was that as I was healing, as I was learning, as I was reading my life in bullet points, in pamphlets and books, was kind of this question of, why does no one talk about this? Why did none of the adults notice? Why did no one check in or intervene? And it inspired me to go into kind of advocacy work. So, first thing I did, to make a long story short, I Googled my local domestic violence agency. They eventually asked me to speak at a community vigil. And before I knew it, this was my mission in life. This was my path, this was my career. And over the next several years, I put all these pieces back together, but interestingly, through advocacy, kept finding mentors, role models, safe spaces, a community of people to belong to. I was working on policy efforts with my local YWCA, a women's organization. I joined a board of directors. I eventually went back to school 7 years later, and I graduated as valedictorian of my class with a degree in justice studies. And this has now just become kind of my soapbox cause, or my survivor mission, as the great author Judith Herman would say. And I'm so grateful for this. And I share this because, as I mentioned, as a kid, I would not have believed you had you told me that this could be my path. I just never would have believed it, or believed you, and I would have shut down. But I share that because the same way I had a story waiting to unfold, I believe every child does. And I think what you do is so incredibly important, because this is the intervention. These are the pivotal moments. These are those opportunities to help children become who they are meant to be and live the life that they deserve, safe, free from harm, and most importantly, discovering who they authentically are. So, what are those conditions, right? We talk about the role of healthy, stable, safe, supportive, caring adult relationships. But what exactly does that look like? What are the components? What are the elements? So, let's shift into some practical strategies. And as I've mentioned, some of them might be refreshers, some of them might be brand new. We're all at different spaces and phases on this call. But let's talk about what some of those strategies are to create those safe, stable relationships. So, first, when we talk about being trauma informed, I think I just want to make a real simple clarification that being trauma informed does not mean that you have to know a ton about trauma. You don't have to understand neuroscience. You don't have to talk to a child about their traumatic experiences. Being trauma informed simply is a mindset. It is an approach to care. It is simply not asking what's wrong with this child, which I doubt any of you do, but having that curiosity, right? To constantly be asking what experiences have caused this behavior or this resistance or this wall to go up. What unmet needs might this behavior be expressing? Approaching with that constant curiosity and kind of holding on to this belief that there is no such thing as bad kids, right? That badness is not a thing, that bad behavior or challenging behavior is simply, you know, unmet needs, or that misguided energy in them just simply trying to get what they deserve. And, being trauma informed is really leaning into this belief that well being is restored by nurturing resilience in kids, right? That resilience forward, strengths based practices are what's needed to not only heal and maybe reverse some of the challenges that these kids have faced, but also these serve as protective factors too, so that even children who maybe don't need such intense reworking of their experiences, these are also protective factors for them. And when we focus on resilience, this is much of what Erin had mentioned. There are common, consistent factors that come up in all the research on resilience: supportive adult child relationships, a sense of self efficacy, having self regulatory skills, feeling valuable. And today, what I'd like to do is just kind of break this down into kind of three conditions that we can filter our safe relationships through, right? As safe, caring adults, what are the conditions that we should focus on? What are those elements that we should be incorporating, both individually and in our systems as well, right? In our organizational approaches to things. So let's talk about each one. And by all means, if you have ideas, strategies that have worked for you, I welcome you to pop into the chat and share, because we are here with collective wisdom and I love when we can learn from each other. So let's break it down with the first one. And I'm sure that the concept of safety is not new to anyone, right? Safety is critical for positive youth development. We know this. And this is especially true for those whose histories might include trauma, loss, disrupted attachment, instability, or involvement with care systems. Because when kids come from unsafe spaces, as we've discussed, this puts them in that heightened state of alert. They're kind of wired to be in a constant state of survival, right, or stress. So, safe environments help buffer the toxic stress. They reduce that sense of threat, and they help kids kind of build a more regulated, calm nervous system. And also, creating safe environments is the stepping stone to building trust in relationships. Because, as we probably know, kids who do not feel safe are going to really struggle to open up to someone. Also important, safety is not defined by us as adults or our intentions or what we think we're doing. Safety is defined by what a child experiences as safe and feels as safe. And when we really think about that, sometimes we approach things a little bit differently. When we think about what is their experience in this moment, what might they be feeling in this room, in this environment, in this office, right? That is going to allow us to filter kind of our approaches through in a different way. So feel free, like I said, pop in the chat strategies that you use to create what we're discussing, which is psychological and emotional safety. And I know everybody has different types of roles. You might be an educator, you might be a caseworker who works on these cases. So, how do you achieve safety in your work? And what I'll do is I'll share just kind of some of the most common ones, some of the evidence backed strategies. And again, some might be obvious to some people. Some might be, oh, a little light bulb goes off. I'm going to try that. That's my hope. And while you're welcome to take notes, a little spoiler at the end, I'm going to give you a great 2-page PDF with a quick reference of all of this. So, what can we do? What are the practical ways to incorporate safety? So, we are talking about environmental comfort, situational comfort, creating these kind of welcoming, regulation, supportive spaces. I love it. I'm already seeing some of my bullet points. Being consistent, reliable, structure, routine, familiarity. Yes. One of the most common ones that you will hear, and Erin even mentioned it in the opening, is this idea of routine, right? Predictability, preparation, reducing unnecessary surprises or abrupt transitions. For kids who have come from traumatic or challenging environments, they do not have a sense of predictability. That state of toxic stress is inherently unpredictability, uncertainty, never knowing what might happen, how a person might act. And it creates that feeling of powerlessness, right? That can be so damaging for a child. So, what does it look like to prioritize routine, predictability, meaningful rituals? Well, this can be as simple as previewing what's to come. If you have a class, you preview the day's lesson. If you have a case meeting, you preview what's going to happen that day. If something's happening tomorrow, you preview that. Little things like visual schedules can be really helpful, right? Not all kids can hear and process, especially if they're in a toxic stress state. Cognitively, they might not be hearing it. So, giving things like visual schedules, transition warnings, consistent check ins, And if you are somebody who works with young people on a recurring basis, whether you have a group or a classroom, creating these meaningful rituals, things that you do on a regular basis, is really powerful because kids feel safe when they can kind of say, I know what's to come, right? I know what's coming next. I love it. Being regulated myself, yes. Being honest, trustworthy, saying yes, being flexible, excellent. So, another thing that we can focus on too is just being really clear about expectations and setting clear boundaries. Again, kids feel safe when they kind of know the rules, know how they can behave, know what, lines are not there and which ones they can't cross. Follow through is also really important for kids who have experienced trauma. Most kids who come from traumatic backgrounds are used to living in a state of incongruence. The person that loves them also hurts them. The person who says, I'm sorry, I'll never do that again, then goes and does that again. And so when it comes to working with kids, making sure that we follow through and we're reliable and kind of have integrity of our word really matters, right? Because trust comes from the follow through. So, for example, if you say, before I leave, I'm going to make sure that I do this, we want to make sure we do it. Because for a normal kid, they might not think twice about it. I don't want to say normal. For a child who has been less exposed to harm, they might not think anything about it. But for a child who has had a challenging background, that might feel like another betrayal, another lie. I can't trust this person. Of course, we can create safety by honoring their identity, their culture, their values, their lived experiences, their important relationships. We can use active listening and non judgment, right? People who have experienced trauma are afraid of shame. They are embarrassed. They maybe don't want to open up. So, in every conversation, if we can show just genuine interest, active listening, that creates a physical feeling and experience of safety on the body. We want to model those calm reactions, right? As some of you said in the chat, making sure that I need to, right? It's what do they call it? Mirror neurons, right? That my body language, my stance, my tone is also going to express a lot on this young person. And we can also just make sure that we're avoiding, punitive, fear based, or even just kind of isolation based, like disciplinary responses or compliance. And rather, we're shifting to kind of more restorative and supportive practices, going back to that kind of mindset question of, what might this child need in this moment? And these are things that we can do in our work professionally, no matter what your job is. But these are also things that we want to empower families to build skills around, right? To allow parents and caregivers and new caring adults in these children's lives to use these skills as well. We also, of course, want to take this beyond our own individual work and look at systems, right? Do our environments, policies, and responses increase emotional safety? Do they support predictability? Or do they unintentionally reinforce instability and a power dynamic, right? Where a child does not feel safe or that they know what's going on. So that's our first one, right? Is creating that safe environment. I'm going to quickly look at the chat. Yeah, listening and affirming. Listening without judgment was a big response of teens in a survey in Wisconsin. Love that. Yeah, thank you for sharing that link. So we want to create these safe environments, right? That's something we can do to create these safe relationships, right? We have to be safe adults. And that doesn't just mean that I show up and I know I'm safe and I know I'm going to help this kid. We need to be intentional sometimes about just remembering to do these little things. The next area that we can look at is obviously building relationships by building connection, right? And what does it mean to truly connect with a child? How do we build that? Well, connection at the end of the day is always about belonging, right? And for youth who have experienced adversity, especially abuse and neglect, the strongest wounds that they face are relational wounds, right? A loss of trust in relationships, in others. And many kids feel a term I used to use was like exiled, right? I don't belong anywhere. I don't belong to my community. I'm bullied at school. My family isn't supporting me. You really feel very alone in the world. So, supportive relationships, building connections, doesn't just serve to, calm a child's nervous system, be there to co regulate, help them with the toxic stress response, but they also restore something deeply important in healing, and that's trust and belonging. So, how do we be intentional about building connection? This is a question I always love to ask because everybody has such great ideas. Because as we know, these kids can be resistant, quiet, withdrawn, challenging. So, again, drop your best strategies in the chat of how you have built connection with young people or how you advise your families to start building connections with their adopted child. And again, I will go through just some of the evidence-based practices. So, not on this list, and this is so simple but so effective, is just greeting a young person by their first name. A lot of kids are not used to that. And as much as it sounds like just a small little shift, it makes such a big impact. Whether you are working one-on-one and you're doing a case visit, or whether you have a classroom or a group of young people that you work with, using their first name over and over again repeatedly says to that child, I belong here, right? I'm seen. I am wanted. I am a person and not just a body coming in and out of this room or this house or this group. We also want to take, obviously, a genuine interest, right, in children beyond their behaviors or managing them or beyond case matters. And taking a genuine interest sometimes is talking about stuff we have no idea about. My partner's child, I had to build a relationship with him by talking about video games, and it is like another language to me. Tell me about what's that character? What's their color of their outfit? I have no idea what I'm saying. But I ask about video games, he opens up. And as someone who has led countless groups and programs, especially with at-risk kids, they love talking about things that are just unique to their life. Maybe it's a little hobby of theirs. Maybe it's a book that they really love. Maybe it's their pets. Maybe it's their favorite food. So we want to show genuine interest in just getting to know them. We often have to make what people call consistent like bids for attention over time. So it's like volleying a ball to a child and knowing that they're going to let it go past their head over and over and over, but one day they will volley it back. So we just slowly and consistently make these interactions, right? These slow repeated interactions over time, and eventually kids start to realize it's safe. I can build these connections. We want to use a attuned language that, centers kind of you matter here, you're not a problem. This can be as simple as acknowledging when a child is present and acknowledging when they weren't. So, for example, you might say, I'm so glad to see you this week. I really missed seeing you last week. Or, so glad you're having dinner with us tonight. We really missed you at the dinner table last night. We wanted to ask about how your test at school went. So, acknowledging their presence and their absence. Again, you matter here and you belong here, and we want you here. And when you're not, we're sad that you're not here. There's also some really fascinating research about increasing our positive acknowledgement of kids. Sometimes when kids are challenging because of their past, a lot of times it's just corrective, kind of off task acknowledgments. And there's one study that says that for every one negative or kind of corrective comment to a child, we should be doing 5 positive or neutral ones. So kind of something to think about. This is certainly true for, parents who experience a lot of stress with their kids. These are just like little challenges that we can try to be aware of and try to incorporate, and it makes a big impact, right? So the kids, again, don't feel I'm bad, I'm broken, I'm wrong. We want to make sure we're balancing both of the things that we're recognizing. Noticing and checking in really matters, right? Especially when something seems off, so that kids don't feel like I'm alone, I have to figure this out on my own. Keeping connection during difficult moments just as much as the good ones. And then also prioritizing adult support. And maybe this is systemic, right? Maybe this is part of your organization and how you kind of, institutionalize some of these practices. But one of the things I've seen really effective, for example, in schools, is a school will do a connections assessment where they'll kind of put all the names of all the kids on a board and teachers come and initial if they have a relationship with that kid. And you see the gaps, right? You see the kids that maybe don't have that trusted adults. So making sure that every child that you interact with kind of has those people in their life. Or if you do work with groups or, in a school setting, maybe helping them build peer-to-peer relationships, because that's part of belonging too. You can build on some of those routines and meaningful rituals by doing things like having a classroom circle. Maybe the Monday morning or every week you start the meeting with a certain moment to sit down and share something. So finding ways to kind of build those relationships among peers, providing leadership and mentor roles, right? There's a lot of ways that we can think about building belonging. And I think a lot of this is just asking ourselves that question, like, does this child have opportunities in their life to feel like they belong? And if not, what's like one small thing we can try, or a strategy or a program or something that they can get involved in? And as I mentioned, just like before, these are things that we can do individually. But from a systems reflection, right, we can ask, does our current system prioritize time for relationship building and consistency? Or do our processes and demands and caseloads unintentionally disrupt that opportunity to build connection and trust? So just knowing how important this is. And then the last piece that I want to share, and I'll kind of move through it a little bit more quickly because, really we're talking today about the importance of healthy, safe, stable relationships as a buffer to these situations. But I think this piece isn't discussed enough. And that's the fact that kind of the big third aspect of building resilience in young people is helping them regain or even build for the first time a sense of self mastery. And that's kind of a big term that it encompasses a lot of different things. But as we all know, trauma can leave young people feeling powerless. There's a term in psychology called learned powerlessness, right? They often lose that sense of agency and autonomy. Their sense of kind of control, or their internal sense of control, doesn't exist, right? The world chooses my life for me. I don't have choice. And many young people either lose their sense of identity and authentic self, or if they're very young, never get a chance to even explore what that is. So when we can focus on self-mastery, or what I often call just agency, building, identity, competency, self-awareness, a belief in their ability to navigate challenges and experience new outcomes, that is like that next piece of just opening up and learning to thrive. So how can we do that? I'll keep it short and sweet. Well, as we all know, we talked about this. I saw it in the comments. Co-regulation before expecting kids to know how to self-regulate. We use these moments as caring adults in their life to help them navigate understanding their emotions, being aware of the little signs when they start to act or feel a certain way, helping them to pause, reflect, adopt healthy coping tools, problem solve. Maybe we actually set up, calming physical spaces like calming corners or chill out zones. And that can be done in someone's home, right? Just to give kids a moment to kind of re-ground. We can shift from kind of timeouts and isolation to restorative time ins, where when a kid is really acting out or really shutting down or really challenging, we want to lean into those moments and use that again to teach, learn, process, co regulate, and kind of use mistakes as learning opportunities. And this was mentioned up in the safety piece by someone, which again, all of these reinforce and complement each other. It's like a flywheel of conditions. So providing choice, options, accommodations whenever possible. Kids who have experienced coercive control or abuse or neglect often feel they don't have a voice. And giving them options, even with the littlest things, can be really helpful. If you're, in a group setting and you have an assignment, you might say, you can write or you can draw, whatever feels most comfortable to you. You can talk to me or you can write it down. Would you like to do this today or this? Giving kids a chance to practice using their voice is so impactful, and kind of incorporating their voice, using collaborative language at all times, especially in decision making that might involve them. And, using your role as a caring adult to kind of identify and help them explore what their unique strengths might be, their their identity, their self-concept, and just reflecting on that, allowing them to build what we would call pathways thinking to see what might be next for them. And, when I look back on my own story, all of these pieces are so clear, and I don't have the time to kind of explain it, but the sense of safety, predictability, belonging, joining a community of other inspiring, supportive people, building my sense of self again, my identity and competence, and therefore confidence, really is kind of the combination of factors and environments that allowed me to tap into resilience. And this is true for all young people who have experienced harm. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that we also should be thinking about toxic stress from a caregiver standpoint too, because we want caregivers and families and parents to be able to have the tools to effectively care for their children. So I'm sure that your programs are already doing this, but really looking at kind of those social behavioral determinants of well-being, making sure families have access to resources and items that they might need, or addressing community-based issues. We want to make sure that we're also applying all of this to caregivers and, as a bonus, to yourself as well, because you also need to feel safe. You also need to feel supported and feel that you also have some agency and autonomy in your work as well. So, my goodness, these webinars always fly by. So, just to kind of summarize, resilience and positive outcomes are shaped by these repeated experiences of safety, belonging, and empowerment over time. And as we've mentioned once, and I'll say it again, ACEs and trauma do not determine outcomes. They impact outcomes, but we can come in and serve as that intervening party, that caring adult, to change the trajectory of a child's life. And this is why what you do is so important. And I think if there's any one thought I can leave you with, it's this, that you do not need all the answers. And as much as we shared a lot of ideas today, you don't need to do all of them at all. Simply being a caring presence in this child's life is a protective factor. Just being there and consistently showing up. All you need to do is be there in their life, extend a lifeline, see when they need something, invite other people in to offer help. But your role is so powerful, and just being there, as I mentioned, is protective and supportive. So, with that, this flies. I want to thank you all. Here is my information. If anybody wants to reach out, if you want some kind of further like nerdy resources on anything I've mentioned, I have so many resources available, and I know that the National Center does as well. I will also drop a link to that PDF summary in the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much. I think you're doing life-changing work, and it's been my honor to be here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley. So before we wrap up, I want to extend a sincere thank you to Ashley for sharing your time and expertise and valuable insight with us today. We really appreciate the thoughtful content and discussion you brought to the webinar. And then just thank you to everyone who joined us today. We know everyone's busy, and we appreciate you sharing your time with us to discuss this important topic. So last, if you want and are able to, I'm going to share my screen. And to stay connected and learn more about what we're doing at the National Center, like Ashley shared with her resources, including upcoming webinars and events, you can follow us along on LinkedIn or join our email list. We'd love to keep you informed about future opportunities and resources. Erin dropped a link to our evaluation, and there's also a QR code right here on the corner. If you will please complete a brief evaluation survey, it really helps us, your feedback, continue improving our programs and our offerings that are available to you. And finally, we'll be sending out the webinar resources and follow-up materials within the next few days. So keep an eye out on your inbox, and just really thank you again for being here today. And we hope to see you at a future webinar. Thanks again, Ashley. The content was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And we will wait. I'll end it right at 1, so you have time, a little bit more time to complete the evaluation. All right. Thank you all. Have a great day.